I'm Ron Hoge, class of 67. My wife and I have had a journey that's led us living out of the U.S., living, traveling, working, raising family for most of our adult lives, and so our lives together. And that's kind of formed an interconnectedness for us with the globe that we really drives us and drives our thinking about what's important in the world. And so along the way, I think we've seen firsthand the challenges of various parts of the world in many important ways. And we feel that this interconnectedness, particularly for the next generation or two, is so strong that if we're not addressing the challenges of the world in a more comprehensive, effective way, then our children and grandchildren are going to feel it even more dramatically than we feel it. So our focus on philanthropy, our focus in on social change has been more global than national, just by choice. And along the way, we've tried to find organizations, institutions, initiatives, which we think check the box of dealing with core problems in various parts of the world at the grassroots level, bottom up versus top down. Really cost-effective solutions that are not only cost-effective but scalable because of that cost-effectiveness, but also scalable across cultures, across regions, so you can leverage into something significant, are clearly measurable, so you can see outcomes and the impact it's having in those parts of the world, and hopefully, because of that, self-sustainable. Along the way, we've explored a lot of organizations to invest time, money, and energy into. And by accident or by design, we're very proud, excited about the fact that two of those organizations were founded by Amherst alums. Boris Bulayev, who is on my left, and from the class of 2007, and Bill Ryerson from our beloved class of 67. Their organizations, Educate and Population Media Center, will be the focus of this session. We're not saying these are the only things that are happening in the world, but what they're doing in both cases, I think, are truly remarkable, and we just wanted a chance to share with those who are interested, to learn their stories and the kinds of things they're doing, because I believe, Diane and I believe, they can have a dramatic impact in parts of the world who really need that help. So the process or format is Diane will introduce Boris. Then Boris has 15 or 20 minutes to give you a flavor of what he's doing. Save your questions, because we like then to switch to Bill, and then Bill can talk Population Media Center, giving us hopefully 10 or 15 minutes at the end, 10 anyway, for Q&A that can be directed to either one or both of them. So with that, let's get started, and Diane, you're going to introduce Educate.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome. Can you hear me? Louder? No. Can you hear me here now? Yeah, our passion, Ron and I's passion, has been international travel, and it all started in 1973 when we quit our jobs and traveled around the world for a year in 1973. And that had such a huge impact on us, because at that point we said to ourselves, hey, we don't want to travel through, we want to go live someplace. So we came back to the States, and luckily Cummins Engine took him back. They had talked us into a leave of absence, and then we orchestrated that we could have assignments abroad. In fact, our three children have been born on 3 different continents, or as I like to refer to them, my little souvenirs. When we came, I think it was 5 years ago, to the reunion, I noticed on the agenda was this thing about Educate in Uganda. Boris over here and his partner, and they had only been at it 5 years, right, Boris, at that point? And I listened to it, and of course it fits right into our wheelhouse of things that we're interested in, and I went running up to him at the end, and we started talking, and then I was in Uganda 3 or 4 years ago, and he, for a separate reason, and he was there, and we met, we had dinner, we drank a little wine, right? And then the next day I was able to visit the project, the offices, and see what they're doing. I met several of the students. It's sort of a very unique program that they have there. It's about mentoring and entrepreneurship, and they actually, and it's not like they're going building schools. What they're doing is they're going into secondary schools and working in partnership with the administration and teachers And then the students get in, and I was sort of amazed. I was telling Boris this, they have this kind of list, the students, of checks things that they have to accomplish. And I thought that was so nice and organized, actually, Boris, you know, because sometimes it can be scattered. What are we supposed to do? Blah, blah, blah. It's very well organized. The other part of it that the program I like is the girls, the impact it has on girls. As you all know, with microlending around the world, females are the ones that benefit the most in some ways, because the guys will just, you know, go and drink it or something, and they were the ones who worry about the kids' schooling and all of that. So again, this is major, and it's businesses. They are developing businesses at these schools, so that when these kids graduate, unemployment is so high in Uganda that this gives them an opportunity to start their own businesses and then support each other and become further mentors in their communities. And so I think what is going on with Educate is a model, for certain, a model that can be used in a lot of developing countries. Currently in Uganda, Rwanda, and Kenya now, and supported by you know, the Gates Foundation, MasterCard Foundation, all kinds of people who recognize that this program, how important this is. So anyway, Boris, why don't you come up and tell us all of that?
All right, thank you. Thank you, Diane. Can you guys hear me all right? Great, I'm just gonna stand over here and float, and hopefully you'll see my slides. So my name is Boris Bulayev, I'm class of 07. And this is Educate. We work to transform education in Africa to teach youth to solve poverty. So making high school education really practical and relevant so young people have the skills after school to start businesses, get jobs, and make more money. To tell you a little bit about myself, that's me at age 7. If that picture looks very Soviet, it's because it is. This was my first day of school in Latvia. I would move to the US 3 weeks later and consider myself very lucky, 1, because I came here, and 2, when we were getting by on welfare and food stamps, I got into a really good public school track in San Francisco that eventually got me here, which was really this world of opportunity. And you know, just kind of being back here reminds me how incredible a place Amherst was for my own development. And when I got here, I didn't make the basketball team, which was my dream. I'm not very tall. I was last one cut. And that team did win the national title, to my defense. But when I didn't make the team, I was looking for what was next, and I began to realize what I would later hear President Clinton say, which is that talent is equally distributed, but opportunity is not. And I think that really resonated with my own experience, and it really resonated with kind of where I'd come and where I was. And so there was a classmate of mine who had gone to Uganda when he was 17 and started paying for a Congolese refugee to go to school. And so we ran a bunch of, we ran dodgeball tournaments, had a date auction, a bunch of different stuff on campus, raised some money, raised $100,000 our senior year, and when we were graduating, kind of leaving our office, our headquarters in Mayo, we went to Uganda to figure out where to go and how to make this more of a real thing. And we saw a few big things that really drive our purpose. One is that Africa matters, and it's going to matter even more in the years to come. Populations is projected to grow from 1.2 to 4 billion, so 40% of the world will be African by the end of the century. So it's going to play a much bigger part in the world. And with it, families spend up to a third of income to send their kids to school on the hope that education will deliver the same promise that it gave me. But for many, that promise is broken. And even a majority of university graduates can't get formal employment because jobs don't really exist. So the only option is really starting your own business, and school isn't really aligned to that. And we believe education, and particularly secondary education, is a hugely untapped resource for development. And we believe when you think about touching youth at scale, and how do you impact youth at scale, the only infrastructure governments have is high school. And the last thing we believe is youth can be the solution, and there really have to be. And kind of my back of the envelope calculations, there could be more high school age youth in Africa by the end of the century than there will be people in the U.S. And so with that, I kind of wanted to ask you guys, given this reality, what kind of education do you think African youth need? couple of volunteers. I know it's early. It's really early for me. English?
So that's a good place to concentrate on the basic side.
Great. Primary? That's a good rate of return. Anyone else? Agriculture, so kind of relevant skills. Anyone else? Vocational ed. How do you define that?
Anything from working as a mechanic, electricians.
Tangible skills. Yeah. Financial literacy. Yeah. Technology. Yeah. So we agree with a lot of that, and we really work to make education aligned to life after school so young people have the skills they need, and work to create a model of education that leads to leadership initiative, small business creation, jobs, and ultimately improve livelihoods. And so as Diane was saying, we do that in a couple ways. One, we partner directly with high schools, and two, we work to integrate what we do into national education systems. When we work directly with schools, sorry about this clip, we teach a skills course focused on leadership, entrepreneurship, and workforce readiness to 40 students per school. Those students also get mentorship and then lead a business club, which is open to the entire school. Students are generally in the last 2 years of high school, but they could be a little younger. They use portfolio, which Diane was mentioning, where you actually have to do things and check off things that you've done. And we have this delivered by a youth mentor, who's generally a graduate of our program. And so I'm going to show you guys a little video. This is an old video from 2011. We actually got it made for us when the reality TV show star Lauren Conrad visited us. But it's a really great story, so I thought it articulated the impact of the work. We have sound.
Those, both HIV positive and non-HIV positive.
Lillian is a graduate of the Educate Mentorship Program, which trains young people to become the leaders of the future. Uganda has the youngest population in the world. 50% are under the age of 15, compared with just 13% of Americans. Educate's mission is to harness and develop this youthful potential, giving young people the skills and confidence to make a difference in their communities.
I accepted the fact that I'm an orphan and I've lost my mom, I've lost my dad. I had all the struggles, and sometimes I could sit back and think how I wish my mom was here, how I wish my dad was here. I think this would be happening. That is kind of what we always have in our daily lives as orphans.
Educate is an organization that develops young leaders and entrepreneurs in Uganda and across Africa by providing long-term mentorship and training in entrepreneurship and leadership to students to be able to devise solutions to Africa's most pressing problems.
Educate has enrolled over 1,400 students in 24 high schools across Uganda.
I like mentoring because it helps me to create a difference in somebody's life. For the past 1 year I've been a mentor, I've realized that I've been a significant impact to a number of youth, and I have helped students, to change their mindset. And it's from the mindset that a student can create change in their societies.
I approached him and told him, you know what? I'm in senior 6, but I want to be in this club. I kept him until 2010 when we graduated from the program.
Dianne Hoge got the confidence out of the Educate class. She identified the women who were widowed, and at the same time, most of whom were HIV positive, and looked through what she could do with the ladies, and the skill that she had was making paper beads. So she was able to get these ladies together and then teach them that skill that she already have. For students to be able to use those resources that they already have is what we have seen Lillian get to do and execute perfectly well.
We are replacing what the ladies formerly used to do. They used to work in stone quarries. They used to break down stones. Most of them have moved away from doing that.
Lillian is one of several alumni who've created successful projects that are having a positive impact on their communities. Danielle created an energy-saving cooking stove, and Samuel studied a local village school.
From the business that I'm doing, I'm sponsoring myself at the university.
Help educate, support young leaders and entrepreneurs in Africa.
So that's a great example. This was from 2011, so we were on a much smaller scale then. So Lillian is an example of the impact of our program. Across the board, we've seen roughly a doubling of income in students at the end of the program in a randomized controlled trial that we've ran, which is kind of the best way to capture impact. We saw, as Diane mentioned, a bigger impact on girls. We just saw this hold up at greater scale in a different evaluation we've done. We also saw 64%, we've seen a 64% increase in percent with the business, and most recently we saw a 50% increase in employment at the end of the program. We've scaled up a lot, even since that video. We're now in about 17% of high schools in Uganda, so 500 schools, working intensively with 20,000 students at a cost of less than $100 per student. Kind of two big things that make us unique is one, tying education directly to life outcomes and measuring that, and two is designing for scale. We've scaled ourselves as an organization. So our budget for 2017 is $4 million, up from the $100,000 we raised at the end of college. We have 130 staff and 190 mentors. I'd say Africa non-fundraising staff, I'd say there's probably like 7 people who are not East African on our team. We also have 190 mentors, and we've gotten some great recognition. The thing that I'm proudest of, Brookings, which is the thought leader in education globally, did a learning initiative on scaling education last year, and we were one of the 14 case studies of scaling education alongside some of the biggest organizations in the world, Teach for All, which is Teach for America International, Sesame Street, which is actually how I learned English, Brock, Room to Read, and other organizations. And so we're not done yet. Our vision for 2024 is to measurably impact 1 million students annually and 4 million more broadly. The measurably impacted 1 million is our big driver. That's a lot. We're at 20,000 right now, so we have a long ways to go. We see a tidal wave of demand for relevant education that addresses the mismatch between education and life after school. And there's really a tidal wave of demand for this across the continent. There's 10 plus countries that are engaged in some sort of skills or competency-based high school education reform that's trying to make education directly aligned to life after school. And we believe that kind of the biggest reform challenge is making change in policy, which is relatively easy to do, lead to change on the ground. And that's exactly what we have experience doing. And so this is kind of the last thing that makes us unique, and really the biggest thing is that we really commit to trying to integrate what we do into national education systems with measurable change in life outcomes for students. And so what we've done is we've mapped our Dereck program and the impact we've had directly on what it looks like when we integrate it into the national education system. The biggest kind of breakthrough is in 2012, we got our curriculum, business club, and a practical exam integrated into the last 2 years of high school in Uganda, which was a first big reform win. And in it, we learned that content wasn't enough. If you just change content, it could still be taught in a really rote, memorization-based way. The teacher writes stuff on the board, the students copy it down. And so we realized that there needs to always still be a pedagogy change. And so Skills Lab is our approach for creating student-centered teaching at a systems level. It's a really simple framework called Build, Practice, Present, where students spend a third of their time building knowledge, a third of their time practicing in groups, and a third of the time presenting and engaging with each other. And so it can be applied in any subject. It's kind of like a science lab equivalent for practical subjects, but can really be a way to lock in to very simply lock in student-centered teaching at a systems level, because it's very easy to do and you can visually identify it. Students are sitting in groups when it's happening. And so with that, when we think about changing the education system, we think there's kind of 2 levels at which to work. One is technical advisory, which is changing policy and targets the ministry. That's what we've done in Uganda in 2012. In Rwanda in 2015, we actually got a weekly skills lab required for every student in the last 3 years of high school. So 215,000 students are going through a curriculum that includes that. We also got a business club integrated in. And so that's been a huge technical advisory win for us. But we believe that changing policy is not enough. There needs to be what we call national government partnership, which is school-level support to change behavior in line with the reform. And in Rwanda, we're actually testing in another randomized controlled trial a teacher training program for 2 years to try to do that, to see what happens when we combine education reform through technical advisory with actual school-level support. And so Uganda, Rwanda are 3 countries. We're scaling in Uganda. We did a successful upper secondary reform. The last 2 years of high school, we're working on the lower secondary reform now. We had a big education reform win in Rwanda in 2015. They're now testing this teacher training program. And we're really well positioned for a huge full education overhaul in Kenya they haven't done a reform since 1985. So our biggest opportunity to date. And so currently launching in Kenya. And kind of the long-term vision is that as there's greater pressure on population, greater pressure on youth employment, there'll be more and more demand towards making high school education really relevant. It already exists. It's actually more donors that prioritize primary and transition to secondary. And our goal is to be the service provider, to help be the go-to for governments in making their high school education really aligned to life after school. And so with that, I have one testimonial from a Amherst board member, but just wanted to say that Amherst has been such a big part. We would have never imagined we'd be here 10 years ago when we graduated. Definitely more than exceeded our expectations, but Amherst alums have been there to coach us, mentor us, support us. Our first board member, board chair, is sitting in the back. Amherst has been a really foundational piece of getting where we are, and we definitely think we have a long ways to go and hope that Amherst will remain a part of that.
Good morning. I'm Dereck Whittenburg from the class of '87, and Boris just asked me to say a few things. I met Boris soon after that video was made, and at an alumni event in New York about Amherst alums in Africa. And I went up to him afterward. I thought it was really interesting, and I said, how can I get involved? And I ended up on the board, and here I'm still here, so that's a good thing. Anyway, Boris asked me to say a few things about, we recently had a board outing in Uganda in March, and it was an awesome experience to go be on the ground and see the organization in action. And for me, the highlight was being in the classroom and seeing it happen, seeing the teacher, seeing the children, listening, meeting mentors, seeing a business club where the kids came up and showed us we're making necklaces or purses or just something to make a little bit of income to help their family. And it's very raw. You go to the classroom and you see it happen, and it was just very striking for me. So anyway, it's a great organization. Boris and his team are doing a great job. So thanks for listening. Thanks for coming out.
So we'll save questions if you have them till the end, as I said earlier. Second is Bill Ryerson with the Population Media Center. Bill and I are classmates at Amherst, but Bill and I have been classmates since 3rd grade. So I've known him a long, long time. Always knew that Bill was going to do something special. I thought, since he's so statistical, scientifically oriented, he'd be a world-class researcher somewhere, and I think he was kind of headed in that direction, and then in, I guess it's 67 or 68, he read Paul Ehrlich's Population Bomb, and his world changed because he became passionate about the challenge we have in the world way back then, and have even more now, to address population issues, address them effectively at the grassroots level, and fundamentally, as Diane was saying earlier, address them through female empowerment, which is the only way to really grapple with population issues in the world. So Bill had a stellar career at Planned Parenthood here in New England for a number of years and looked as though that's where he was going to continue. And I guess it's like 18 years ago you discovered he'll talk about the Sabito method coming from Mexico to use. I never saw him as an entertainer, but he taking education in entertainment and beginning and effectively making social behavior change happen because of the engagement of an audience in that educational experience. It's serial dramas, it's soap operas, TV and radio, but it's fantastic, the results they're getting. And Bill never lost that statistical background because outcomes are clearly measured, and he'll describe some of those today, and the impact has been really powerful. It's not just in Africa. Bill's doing this all over the world, including the U.S., in the inner city in the U.S. So fabulous program, Population Media Center, founded by him 18 years ago. And Bill, you got it.
Ron, thanks so much. Really appreciate this. And both Ron and Diane, thanks for organizing this. I attended the 1967 class event yesterday called ONeill, Time for Something Different. And I sat listening to people who had changed careers thinking, you know, I actually changed my career the day I left graduate school. I was headed towards teaching biology, and I was a student at Yale, spent 4 years there learning ecology and evolutionary biology, and as Ron mentioned, became very concerned about global sustainability. So Paul Ehrlich's book and my advisor intersected in that my advisor invited Paul to come speak on the Yale campus right after he published this book. And I had dinner with the two of them that night after his talk. That weekend, the two of them and an attorney founded the organization Zero Population Growth. I started the 4th chapter in the country the following year, organized the Yale campus activities for the first Earth Day in 1970, which ended up being featured in Life magazine's Earth Day issue. So on one side of my life is the insects in the laboratory and studying the plant defense mechanisms and how the insects overcame those, and the second side was an activist ending up in Life magazine, and I decided, you know, this is a little more compelling, and it's dealing with global sustainability issues, and when you stop and think about it, sustainability is the ultimate environmental issue, it's the ultimate public health issue, and it's the ultimate human rights issue. This is sensitive. There we go. So this is not the NASDAQ in 1999, although it could be, as everybody knows, these kinds of exponential charts don't go on forever. This is human population growth. We're adding 225,000 people to the dinner table tonight who were not there last night. Tomorrow, another 225,000. And this expanding human impact on the planet, and particularly expanding human habitation, is the major driver of species extinction and loss of biodiversity going on around the globe. And ultimately, when you stop and think about it, the biodiversity, the web of life that makes the planet habitable, is necessary for all of us to survive. Even if one sees other species as natural resources for our own use, which I do not. I think they have a right to exist on their own, for their own reasons, as opposed to just being in service of humans. But nevertheless, the large tracts of green plants and the complex interaction of various species is what makes the planet habitable. So this chart will not go on looking like this forever. Although some economists hope it will. They think more consumers, more taxable income, wonderful. But indeed, as anybody who's taken population biology knows, endless growth in a finite universe with limited resources is not possible. And the big question is going to be, when and how do we achieve a stationary population that can be sustained at a decent quality of life. So I've spent now 45 years thinking about this issue, and indeed Planned Parenthood, when I worked there, was really part of trying to think through how does one address this issue in a human rights context in a way that's effective. And as Ron said, the rights and status of women and girls are key. It was interesting, a colleague of mine from the Population Institute in the 70s, David Poindexter, sat down with Margaret Mead. I like to kid David that he slept with Margaret Mead because the two of them were locked in a staircase at the UN overnight when they stayed too long in some discussion. But at any rate, the two of them went to the head of the U.S. delegation at the first population conference, World Population Conference the UN held in Bucharest, which I attended in 1974, and handed this man, Phil Claxton, a paragraph about the status of women. And they said, you know, we noticed that the draft plan of action put together by the UN Population Fund does not mention the status of women, so we'd like to ask you to introduce this to the intergovernmental session as an amendment to the plan. And Phil looked at them and said, well, this is a meeting about family planning. What's the status of women got to do with it? So we've come a long way since then. Clearly, population, which is not discussed very much in international fora because it is controversial, is a factor in climate change. I did a admittedly back-of-the-envelope calculation that while most of the growth that's occurring in the world is in the countries with the lowest per capita greenhouse gas emissions, the median projection from now to 2050 is an additional 2.5 billion people, and that's assuming significant reductions in birth rates. But that is the climate equivalent of adding 2 United States to the planet. And what we do in terms of level of effort to promote smaller family norms, which will result in better health and better economic welfare, as well as more sustainability, will make a difference between somewhere between the high and the low projection that the UN Population Division makes. And that difference between the high and the low by 2050 is the equivalent of 2 United States from a climate standpoint. So Brian ONeill at University of Colorado Boulder did a calculation about the role population plays with regard to climate change and figured out that between 19 and 26% of what is necessary to avoid catastrophic climate change can be achieved through a major effort in promoting family planning. When we were undergraduates, the population of the planet was about 3 billion, and about 10% of married couples around the world use modern methods of family planning. Today, 56% use modern methods, so tremendous progress. It's one of the big public health success stories. But the 44% non-users of family planning outnumber the 90% non-users from 1960 because of population growth. So there's as big a hill to climb in the future as we have already climbed in the last 60 years. There are about 500 million people who are not using family planning who don't want a pregnancy. There's a slightly larger number who are not using family planning because they want additional children, and that's a key issue. If you look at Niger, the highest fertility rate country in the world, average woman during her lifetime has 7.6 children. If you ask her what she wants, the average woman will say 11, men say 13. So in West Africa, Nigeria, Burkina Faso, Niger, many of the Francophone countries, desired fertility is above actual fertility, and poverty is what's holding them back. What we know from the Asian tigers is that lower fertility has been the driver of economic growth. So as people had smaller families, with no change in family income, they had a little money left over at the end of the month that they weren't spending on food, housing, and clothing. They could save that. That built capital in the capital marketplaces. That allowed businesses to borrow and expand. That built employment opportunities. That led to taxable income and rising incomes that the government could use to build infrastructure like roads and schools that improved economic productivity. People could also spend some of their savings on education, which improved economic productivity. So the term demographic dividend applies to many countries that started out with promoting family planning and small family norms and achieved middle or higher income status as a result. There are 8 countries that have gone from developing to developed status since World War II, and all of them started with family planning and smaller family norms. So how about the people who are not using family planning and don't want to be pregnant? Many people assume that the reason is lack of access, but in fact, in most countries, less than 1% of the reason given is lack of access to services. The top reasons are they've heard it's dangerous, their husband's opposed, their religion's opposed, they're opposed, or they think God determines how many children they're going to have and there's nothing they can do about it, so fatalism. These are the major drivers of what's called unmet need for family planning, and overcoming those cultural and informational barriers is critical to allowing people to achieve what they want. So I started Population Media Center in 1998, as Ron mentioned, to do just that. Because people are not going home at night to listen to public health messages and watch documentaries, we decided to do soap operas. The audience is there for entertainment. People want to relax in the evening and be entertained. And this methodology that Ron mentioned, created by Miguel Sabido, started with his work in Mexico in the 1970s, and he did a show in 1974 or 75. It was a 260-episode telenovela, primetime on Televisa, the biggest network in Mexico, in which he had illiterate characters who were persuaded by positive characters in the program to go through Mexico's adult education program. And one by one, these characters decided they should do this. They struggled through the program. They got their diplomas. They got better jobs, and their lives improved. Sabido had 1/3 of the nation's viewers watching this show. And as he was getting well towards the end of the program, his most popular character was about to graduate, and he decided to run an epilogue in which he gave addresses of registration sites for literacy classes around Mexico. And he warned the Department of Public Education of the government that indeed he might generate a crowd. And they said, oh, no problem. Last year we signed up 99,000 people who responded to our public service announcements, so we love your show, but we can handle any crowd you might generate. So he ran that episode with the epilogue, and the following day, 250,000 people came in a single day. And by the end of the serial, 840,000 people had registered, and thus that launched the Sabido methodology. He did 5 shows on family planning that coincided with Mexico having the most dramatic decline in fertility rate of any developing country in the 20th century. One of his innovations was, in addition to the positive and negative characters that populate all melodramas, he had these middle-of-the-road characters that designed as identification characters for the audience, who gradually, as they gain audience share, sort out the conflicting advice from the positive and negative characters and gradually evolve into positive role models for the audience, showing the audience the benefits of the new behavior and showing how to overcome the obstacles to change. So these characters go back and forth, creating a lot of suspense, keeping the audience on the edge of their seats, and these are often 200 episodes long. So, when you're dealing with BedNet use or something like that, you don't need 200 episodes, but when you're dealing with a man in rural Ethiopia and trying to convince him that his daughter belongs in school and not fetching firewood, that takes time. You can't do that with public service announcements. Whoops. So typically we do 150 to 200 episodes. These characters evolve gradually so they don't create backlash. We're never telling the audience what to do. So there's another reason these shows are not controversial. People are just eavesdropping on the lives of the characters. And they're emotionally bonding with the characters to the point that we get thousands of letters from people saying they have named their baby after this particular character. So when you're getting those letters, you know that character is going to have more influence than the Minister of Health. So all of these are done based on the policies of the host country, all in local languages, all with local writers. We hire the best writers from the National Theater and the Drama Department of the National University and train them in the Speedo methodology. And we do a lot of research, testing the episodes with the audience. Whoops. And, well, the next slide was about research. We do baseline and post-broadcast surveys, and we do extensive monitoring at family planning clinics, among other sites, asking people what motivated the visit. So now for those who took freshman psychology, how many people here at Amherst took freshman psychology? Okay, so you may remember, I still have the book that we used in freshman psychology, and one of the papers that I have never forgotten and carry with me wherever I go is a paper by Solomon Asch on conformism. Solomon Asch would do experiments like this, where he would hold up two objects of different lengths, or draw two lines on the blackboard, and he'd say, okay, which looks longer, the remote, not that they had remotes then, or the booklet? And he had a room full of subjects, all of whom were actually plants. There was only one subject in the room. And he'd call on all the other subjects who had been instructed to lie, and they'd all say the remote. And then he'd get to the poor, uninformed subject. And he named the remote almost every time. So it's very clear people are driven to fit in. And what is the lesson from Solomon Asch's research, published in 1955, is that if you want to change social norms, you first have to change the perception of what is normal. More recent is the work of Albert Bandura, who at 91 still serves as an advisor to us. He's a Stanford psychologist who's known for social learning theory, how people learn from role models, and social cognitive theory. I'm trying to summarize 50 years of research in 2 sentences. Social cognitive theory basically says you must believe that change is possible or you won't try to change. And there are various other psychological and communication theories that are part of the Speedo methodology. There we go. So as I said, these are programs that are addressing difficult issues and particularly ingrained behaviors in societies that can't be addressed easily with short-term interventions. And we do multi-issue programs because nobody wants to go home at night and listen to an AIDS soap opera night after night. So we deal with a whole array of issues. And those issues include particularly gender-related issues, violence against women, girls' education, rights of women in the workplace, family planning use, and other reproductive health services, and environmental issues as well. We also address child protection, child nutrition. We're dealing with cross of issues that include child marriage, marriage by abduction, and child slavery in places like Haiti and West Africa. And we've done this type of work now in 54 countries. We've done many different programs. As Ron mentioned, we have a program in the US, called Islos High. It's on Hulu. We produced 24 half-hour episodes totally on spec. Before putting it out for a network inspection, 8 networks wanted it, and we chose Hulu. It became their top show in season 2 and has been in the top 5 for all 4 seasons. This year is the finale. But if you go to Hulu or go to isloshigh.com, you can watch 60 episodes of what is a rather gripping teen drama that deals with teen pregnancy, obesity, domestic violence, gay relationships, and various other issues. I'm going to give you a few data from Sali Wansai, a program we did in Sierra Leone. And I think because of shortage of time, I'm going to skip through this pretty quickly, but it was twice a week for 2 years. It was listened to by half the population, according to an inline survey of 3,000 people. And many of the listeners discussed the issues of the program with friends. Comparing the endline data we look at with the baseline, we look at differences between listeners and non-listeners, then run multivariate controls to factor out such variables as income, education, place of residence to see if we have a significant change, and that's expressed as likelihood data. So in this case, listeners were almost 4 times as likely as non-listeners to have heard about obstetric fistula, 2.5 times as likely to know that a large family can put the health of the mother at risk, twice as likely to believe that access to contraception would not encourage infidelity, a big issue with regard to male opposition. Almost twice as likely to say they intend to use family planning, 1.6 times more likely to say they talk to others about family planning, 4 times as likely to think it's acceptable to promote information about condoms and family planning on the radio, etc. And to me, the most convincing of the data is at clinics, 1,500 family planning adopters were asked, what motivated your visit? And 50% of them named the program by name. In child marriage, you'll see, you may not be able to read this, in Senegal, listeners were 6 times as likely as non-listeners to believe that a woman should be at least 18 before marriage, and in Nigeria, twice as likely to believe that a woman should be at least 19 before being married. In Nigeria, 67% of family planning adopters named our program in Kano, Kaduna, Katsina, and Sokoto states across northern Nigeria as the factor that brought them to the clinic. And in Sierra Leone, we did include malaria, and listeners were almost 5 times as likely as non-listeners to have acquired a bed net. This data is with regard to Mali and child health. Listeners were twice as likely to say that the health of the mother is the reason they approve of contraception. And these are the countries in which we've done these programs. So a lot in Africa. We've done a couple of telenovelas, one with MTV Latin America in Mexico that played throughout Spanish-speaking Latin America, and we're now doing a second program in partnership with Televisa. And these are countries where we've done such programs. And finally, these are the ones we're currently on the air in, or actually about to go on the air. And these are countries of interest. We have a plan that by the time we're here for our 60th reunion, we will have doubled the size of the organization, be working in 30-some countries. So at any rate, that's our work. And Ron, I'll leave it up to you whether I should show the clip from... Okay, I won't show the clip. At any rate, if you go to eastloshigh.com, you can see really how cleverly these issues have been woven into what is a very gripping, suspenseful drama. Thank you very much. One thing I forgot to mention is we produced a book of photos of human impact on the planet in partnership with the Foundation for Deep Ecology. I'll leave this copy here at Amherst. It's 150 photographs, quite stunning. It's been reviewed by news media around the world with a total readership of 1 billion people. You're welcome to take a look afterwards.
Great, and I did want to just make sure we had some time for Q&A if people wanted. I'd like to kind of finish, I think we need to be finishing at 10, right? I think there's something at 10:10, but if we could lock the doors if people want to keep talking. But basically wanted to have the QA around both of them and any questions you have for either of them specifically or generically. And I don't think I need to do much moderation, but go for moderating, so go for it. Ed? I don't know whether you can, I hate to say this here, could you speak more loudly?
years ago, I went to Tanzania to teach English in the primary school. One of my observations was that what held education back is low pay teachers had. You're going into the system, using the system to carry out your program. I wonder whether low pay for the teachers in the system is an impediment to achieving your goals in the program, addressing that in any way with government.
Was that, repeat the question?
Is low pay for teachers an impediment to our work, and how do we think about that? One of the things I've realized recently that I know Uganda doesn't do this, but at least Rwanda and Kenya spend a percentage of GDP on education that's equivalent to like the rest of the world, and Kenya spends 7%, which is pretty close to Finland and Sweden. So I think the idea that there's more money in the ecosystem is not. That's going to be driven by economic growth. So that has to be dealt with as a constraint. I think the way we would think about that challenge is that, one, you can figure out how to use resources more efficiently. Two, I know there's research that shows that contract teachers who get paid a quarter of what wage teachers make perform better. And three, I think when you're thinking about the resource constraints and the need to drive education, you're going to, one way that things could go is in the way that in healthcare you have a doctor, then you have a variety of different support staff, and so it's segmented across different levels of kind of labor, and I think education will likely have to go in that direction. I think our mentor is one of those actors that's much cheaper than a teacher that could be plugged in to scale education in a cost-effective way.
Jacques? You may need to stand up as well.
I'm really stunned by the power of TV, and I'm also a little troubled by it. And I see the positive message you're getting through these telenovelas and so forth. I'm also worried that there's a dark side of the equation that might interfere with the progress that we've achieved through positive messages in Planned Parenthood and so forth. Would you speak a little bit to those negative people? You know who they are.
Of course.
Have a different perspective on progress.
Jacques, thanks a lot. That's a really important question. The question has to do with the negative side. Can the media have negative impacts as well as positive impacts? And indeed, they can. There have been about 3,000 studies of the impact of violence on television on observers. And while many of us can watch violent programs and not become violent, in large part because we have positive offsetting parental role models, some people are hugely influenced by violent programming, and it tends to increase their tendency to violence. We saw in the case of the Rwanda genocide the use of radio to incite killing. So indeed, the control of the message in broadcasting is very important. Certainly, the U.S. has basically sold out to the highest bidder, as opposed to seeing broadcasting, with the exception of public broadcasting, as being something in the public service. It's there to sell products, and whatever draws the audience is fine, with some limitations. But certainly, many countries have defined their broadcasting differently and put a lot of emphasis on the programs must have a positive, beneficial message. I mentioned in my talk that we actually do our programs based on the policies of the country. So we actually do a formal policy framework, including all the policies of the UN that the country is a signatory to, plus the government's constitution, laws, and policy statements. And the only policies we won't touch are ones that violate human rights agreements or counter UN agreements. But certainly it is very clear that negative programming can influence people in negative ways.
In the back.
Still remarkable breadth of pro-social things that you're tackling. If I could maybe add one to the list, I'm wondering about female genital mutilation being thought of as that or can be addressed. Female genital mutilation is practiced in many African countries, particularly in the Islamic part of Africa, North Africa, and northern sub-Saharan Africa. It is a major theme in many of our programs. We've done maybe, of the 8 soap operas we've done on Radio Ethiopia, maybe 5 of them have had that as a theme. It's had a dramatic impact on the practice of FGM in Ethiopia. The purpose of female genital mutilation is to make sex painful so the woman will not stray from her husband. It's obviously inhumane. It's against UN agreements, but it's practiced and has been for millennia. But there's a consensus around the world that this practice must stop. So this has, that and other forms of violence against women have been major aspects of our work. Domestic violence, marriage by abduction and rape. I'll tell you one story with regard to marriage by abduction, which is still practiced in rural Ethiopia and some other places. We got a letter from a woman in Oromia, Ethiopia, saying, "Thank you for dealing with the issue of marriage by abduction. Our own daughter was abducted on her way to school at age 14 and ended up married as a result. And we've been afraid to send the 12-year-old girls to school for fear the same thing would happen to them. When your program addressed this issue through the character Wu Balam, our entire village, which was listening, came together and we agreed to enforce the law against marriage by abduction, which we had not realized existed, and now it's safe for our 12-year-old girls to go to school."
Yes. You hear that?
Yeah, the question was, how are we addressing violence and terrorism, largely writ? Soap operas are about individual lives, so we're not addressing this like at a policy level. And indeed, policy issues, particularly during the current administration, are probably going to be less and less important, and public behavior more and more important with regard to achieving social welfare in this country at any rate and around the world. We have not worked to a large extent in countries where terrorism is a major factor other than northern Nigeria. There we have not addressed that as a major theme, but we have certainly addressed domestic violence as a major theme, which is closely related. And I'm talking about parent-child and spousal partner violence, as well as employer-employee. And one of the things we've modeled comes out of the work of University of Denver psychologist named Howard Markman, a program called Prevention and Relationship Enhancement Program, or PrEP. It's a couples counseling program where couples involved in domestic violence go through a week of counseling on how to understand the other person's perspective and state it before they state their own, so they're actually debating the issue rather than getting into dehumanization. And we've taken that concept and modeled it on national broadcasts with the help of a PrEP specialist who wrote a manual on how to model empathetic communications in entertainment mass media in partnership with us, that was funded by UNICEF and American Psychological Foundation. We have proposed addressing terrorism in the sense that we talk about it today in various countries like Pakistan. So far we have not done that, but it's not something we want to ignore. It's just we haven't had the opportunity.
John.
You both are dealing with education, and I'm interested how you are helping people move from rote memorization to thinking. I can see it on the table for both of you in ways, but I'd be interested to hear you talk a little more about that. It's a sort of a generic issue rather than something particular that you're dealing with, but it seems to underlie an awful lot of our limited experience in the country of Nepal, and we've seen it in some other places around the world. So I'm interested in how you guys see it.
Yeah, I mean, I think first off, I think rote memorization is an issue everywhere. I went to a top public high school in San Francisco, and there was a ton of rote memorization there. So it's all about extent to which it happens. I mean, I think you learn to think by practicing, and so what we do is try to create educational experiences where students get to practice the skills that they'll use after school. And we try to create an environment that gives students practice in a safe space using all the skills that they'll use after school in life, things like critical thinking, communication, collaboration, thinking creatively, leveraging resources, networking to tap into things. So it's really about, I think one of our core competencies is creating educational experiences that give young people the space to practice these things. And the challenge, obviously, is at a systems level. How do you create a structure that allows a teacher in a rural school who's gotten very little training to do that themselves? And that's what we're trying to crack, and that's where we think Skills Lab is a potential breakthrough around that. But it's really figuring out how do you, at scale, create educational experiences for all young people where they get to actually practice these skills.
I'm going to do one thing to you, Bill, here. Both of them could stay around a little while. I'm just conscious of the Biddy Martin has her 10:30 issue. If anybody needs to leave, wants to leave, has to leave, please do. We'll continue this for a couple more minutes with questions, and then you guys can stick around, right, and have individual conversations. So feel free to leave if you must at this point in time. And now, Bill,
okay.
This question.
Quickly on this issue. How many people here studied the Krebs cycle when they were at Amherst and can still write it out? Now, the issue is education is a process that requires one to get emotionally involved in order to remember something. I would guess everybody in this room remembers September 11th, 2001 better than October 5th, 2008. And yet, October 5th, 2008 is more recent. So what is it about September 11th, 2001 that's so memorable? And what we know from the world of psychology is emotional involvement enhances memory. If you can find a way to get students emotionally involved in a subject, then they remember it. If you can't, they remember it until the final exam and then it's gone. So our view is that melodrama is, and I didn't used to think this, but melodrama is a great teaching tool. I sat in the back of a taxi in Washington, D.C. with a middle-aged Indian gentleman as the driver, and I said, "Where were you in 1985 to 87? He said, "I was in India." And I said, "Did you ever see a program called Hum Log, which means we people in Hindi?" It was the first Sabito-style soap opera outside of Mexico. And he said, "Oh my God, you know Hum Log?" And I said, "Yes, I had a little bit to do with it." And he said, "Well, it was my favorite program. Everybody in the family watched it." And then for the rest of the taxi ride, he told me episode by episode what had happened to the characters and what he had learned from that. So, it's a great teaching tool because the emotional involvement is there. So my view is both types of intellectual education, obviously I spent 4 years at Amherst, very intellectual education and emotion-based education are both useful. In terms of cost effectiveness, when you're doing entertainment mass media and you can actually measure attribution of behavior change to a program, as we have done, the great thing about it is because it attracts huge audiences, and we've had 50 to 75% of entire populations in our audience in countries where there's not huge competition, the cost per behavior change is the lowest of any intervention we've been able to find. Our cost, for example, in northern Nigeria, not particularly friendly place to family planning. Our cost per family planning adopter of the entire 208 episodes, the purchase of primetime airtime across the 4 states and all the research, divided by the number of people who adopted family planning and attributed that decision to the program, was 89 cents. So both types of education are important, and they complement each other. I think one of the things we've been able to do with soap operas is get people to send their daughters to school as opposed to keeping them in the kitchen.
Okay, one more question, Dick. And I know, we'll... Yeah, that was the challenge. So, yeah, plenty of room in the lobby. Continue the discussions from here. Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Boris.